very interesting. There was just a study that a group of folks did where people in the church, when they were asked to describe spiritual growth or spiritual formation, I think a majority of people said it's trying really hard to follow the rules laid out in the Bible. But what you're saying is Jesus does not approach spiritual growth in that way.
Absolutely not. In fact,
how does he approach it, and what's wrong with the here's the rules approach to being a good person?
well, very simply, he knows that the here's the rules and do them doesn't work. And he makes this clear in other passages where he's teaching about this. He's telling us what really matters is what is in your heart. It's what is in your heart that determines, as he says, what comes out of your mouth. And what comes out of your mouth shows what there's a lot of in your heart. And the way of keeping rules is the way of the scribes and the Pharisees. And he understood that always leads to hypocrisy because it fails. You cannot deal with doing what is right by trying to do what is right. You have to become the kind of person who does what is right.
Say that one more time.
You cannot become a person who does what is right by trying to do what is right. You have to become the kind of person who does what is right.
All right, let's just sit there for a minute. What do I do if I just try to do what is right? And what do I do if I try to become the kind of person who does right?
Great. On the first approach, trying to do what is right, you neglect the sources of action. And those sources will eventually overcome you in your efforts to do what is right. If you take Jesus' route, which he describes as going beyond the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, in Matthew 5:20, he puts it that way and then illustrates it. If you go that route, then you change your thinking.
So if, for example, I think, well, I'm not supposed to yell at my kids, so I will try not to yell at my kids.
Find out why you yell at your kids and change that. That's the way you do that. We have an unbelievable problem with pornography in this society, as everyone knows now, because the news likes to report things of this sort, especially if it's religious people, especially if it's preachers, right?
Why do you gesture at me when you say
that?
Well,
I'll gesture at me too then, okay. But the fact of the matter is, pornography comes from how you think about yourself and women, in our case, or men, in the case of women. How do you think about them? And I learned a long time ago as a young man that if I were tempted to utilize another, one of my associates or friends, a young woman, as something to revel in my lust about, that the way to deal with that was to place her before God and see her for who she was, a human being facing a life that will be full of difficulties and disappointments and eventually death, and to pray for that person. You have to think about it. Now, the ordinary person who is caught up in cultivated lusting, as Jesus talks about in Matthew 5, can't even imagine that. So you have to go deeply into how they think about themselves.
I was thinking about this because the language of dying to sin is something that get used and Jesus uses, but it's scary. And I think part of what sounds scary about it is if I'm used to feeling alive through lust and sexual gratification or getting people to applaud, or anger or whatever, and then I think, well, I have to give that up. What I'm aware of in the moment is if that's been my source of vitality and aliveness, and then I say, okay, I'm going to give it up today, I feel dead inside. If I'm cut off from it, I feel like, oh, I'm missing that thing that made me feel alive. And I think for many of us, when we think about dying to sin, what we think of is, I now have to resign myself to living in a state of inner deadness and non-gratification for the rest of my life. And that just sounds like a fate worse than death.
Yes, that's exactly how it appears to people.
So what does Jesus mean when he talks about this idea of dying to sin?
Well, in order to deal with that issue,
Yeah.
and you put it so extremely well, John. I mean, this is exactly, I mean, you talked about the ordinary person who's caught in pornography.
Yeah.
And you suggest they not do it. It's like their mind tilts.
Right.
They can't think of what would their life be like?
Right.
You know. So now that's why the Beatitudes come before this. Okay.
Okay.
Because what the Beatitudes address is this very condition of who is well off.
Mm-hmm.
Life in the kingdom of God is the source of the replacement of all of those little things that we've been hanging on to